Inequality has been a topic of considerable discussion in the realm of political science for centuries. Whether or not inequality was an inherent aspect of human nature has been explored by a number of thinkers, notably Rousseau, Marx, and Nietzsche. Trading Places is a 1983 comedy film that also delves into this topic of inherent inequality. Through a social experiment, the film explores the differences between people of high and low class and the reasons why each of them behave in society as they do. The film ultimately arrives at its own conclusions, but how would the political theorists of the past view this film's take on the nature of inequality? I'm Jeff Lee, and this PS10 talk will cover Trading Places scene 12 minutes 57 seconds to 13 minutes 35 seconds. Now, before we can discuss how each thinker would have viewed the film, it is important to establish each thinker's take on the subject of inequality. For Rousseau, humans are inherently equal in the natural state of man. In Rousseau's point of view, the natural state of man is peaceful and of plenty. Humans are equal when they keep to themselves. Now, according to Rousseau, inequalities arise out of the habits and conventions of everyday life. In his second discourse, he writes, "The extreme inequalities in ways of life, such are the fatal proofs that most of our ills are of our own making, and that we would have avoided almost all of them if we had retained the simple, uniform, and solitary way of life prescribed to us by nature." Pages 137 to 138. Now, to Rousseau, inequality begins with the act of distinction. Distinction being the comparison between ideas, thus distinguishing ideas from each other. In distinguishing things, we separate the fundamental attributes of concepts, drawing lines between them. Thus, the ability to distinguish is the aspect of humans that produces inequality. While humans in the natural state are equal, it is the inherent quality within humans to create inequality. Now, according to Marx, capitalism has redefined the social relationships between individuals. In, Inequality thus arises from these produced social relationships. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx notes that modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Page 35. These power dynamics are essentially what produce inequality. However, inequality is also the facet that spurs progress. Thus, the history of progress is also the history of struggle between the unequal classes of people. Now, in a Marxist sense of history, this can be seen through the struggle and the progression from feudalism to capitalism to eventually socialism and communism. Each of these stages embodying the class struggles between the dominant class and the working class. And finally, Nietzsche supposes that there is no such thing as inherent value, that the only value that exists is that which we give it. Thus, the distinction between values of things is completely arbitrary. Therefore, if inequality is determined by the inherent differences in values, then inequality too must be arbitrary. Nietzsche notes in his Genealogy of Morals, setting prices, determining values, contriving equivalences, exchanging. These preoccupied the earliest thinking of man to so great an extent that, in a certain sense, they constitute thinking as such. Here it was the oldest kind of astuteness developed. Here, likewise, we may suppose, did human pride, as the feeling of superiority in relation to other animals, have its first beginnings. Page 506. According to Nietzsche, truth does not exist. Thus, the absolute inequality between two things must also not exist. And because of this, inequality must not be absolute. Now, when comparing each of these thinkers, we can see that each of them shares elements with the others in terms of how they view inequality. Now, all of them would agree that inequality is arbitrary. Rousseau arguing that inequality arises out of the arbitrary distinctions that we give things, Marx arguing that inequality arises out of the arbitrarily redefined social relationships of capitalism, and Nietzsche arguing that inequality arises out of the arbitrary human decisions to give things value. In this sense, each thinker bounces off of each other. If Rousseau argues that human distinction between inherent qualities produces inequality, Then Nietzsche delves into that further, saying that those inherent qualities that humans are able to distinguish are, in and of themselves, human creations. Thus, people aren't actually distinguishing between inherent properties of things, rather, they are distinguishing between the properties that they themselves gave those things. For Marx, the properties, distinctions, and values that we thus give these things form the backbone to social relationships with each other, thus manifesting the inequalities of things into society with the inequality of class. Now, in terms of solutions, Marx is the clearest with his arguments on progressing society through change. Only through the struggle between the unequal classes can society move towards equality. Now, Rousseau is a bit more regressive on this. If the starting point of humanity is when it was most equal, then in order to regain that sense of equality, we must revert back to the state of nature. And finally, Nietzsche's perspective argues that the achievement of equality is that which is determined by the people in that society. Thus, once people change their values to reflect what equality is, then the definition of equality can be morphed to fit what the society supposes it to be. Now, with the proper background established for Rousseau, Marx, and Nietzsche's thoughts on the nature of inequality, we can connect their perspectives to the movie Trading Places. Specifically, towards the end of the scene, Randolph makes the claim that Winthorpe's the product of good environment, with Mortimer retorting that it's got nothing to do with environment. With his genes, you could put Winthorpe anywhere and he'd come out on top. Now, given what we know about each thinker, we can guess what each of them would suppose. Firstly, Rousseau, with his stance that humans are equal in the state of nature, would argue against Mortimer's suggestion that it is Winthorpe's good genetics that allowed for his successes in life. In fact, he would probably argue in favor of Randolph, in noting that the only reasons why Winthorpe has proven successful over others is particularly due to his distinction from others and his fundamental attributes. In Winthorpe's case, this distinction is shown through his attendance and graduation from both Exeter and Harvard, two institutions that themselves are distinguished as high institutions. The inequality exists in that the distinctions between individuals like Winthorpe and others has been allowed to exist. Now, Marx would agree in the sense that Winthorpe's high status is a result of the capitalist institutions that allowed him to gain his position. Working as the manager of the firm, Winthorpe would, in Marx's view at least, be seen as a member of the bourgeois class. His relationships with the rest of society through his work demonstrate a strict sense of superiority. It is his position that has determined his status, a, a, a position that only exists due to the capitalist system that allows for such a power relationship between a manager and those working under him to exist as well. The inequality exists in that the social institutions have allowed for a dominant submissive relationship to exist in the first place. And finally, Nietzsche would say that Winthorpe's value as an employee is arbitrary, and that the only determining factor in his higher status is simply the acknowledgement of him as that. He simply is successful because society and the people within it created the parameters of what is successful and acknowledged Winthorpe as having those traits. The inequality exists, and that the people place individuals like Winthorpe arbitrarily higher than others. Now, in conclusion, the three thinkers that we discussed today all would seem to have come to a shared consensus concerning the scene from Trading Places, in that all of them would have seemed to have rejected Mortimer's supposition that inequality is an inherent part of human nature. Though based on general deductions, Randolph appears to be correct in his judgment of human nature, simply that all individuals possess the inherent qualities necessary to succeed in society. And the movie agrees with him on that, demonstrating that by trading places, Winthorpe and his counterpart Valentine are able to take on each other's roles when simply placed into each other's positions. In this sense, the movie reflects the debates over inequality in the state of nature, while Rousseau, Marx, and Nietzsche bring different ideas to the table with respect to this topic. There appears to be a united consensus that inequality is a notion that is not inherent within humans, but rather is brought upon following the advent of society. I'm Jeff Lee, and thank you for coming to my PS10 Talk.